On a May afternoon in 1967, a man stumbled out of the woods in Manitoba and flagged down a police car. His shirt was gone. His chest was burned. He was throwing up in the ditch while he waited. And when the officer stepped toward him, the man waved him back because he was afraid he might be radioactive. He said he'd been burned by something that came down out of the sky. The officer didn't believe him. Almost nobody did. And then the burns came back, and they kept coming back on a schedule for years. Here's the strange thing about the man at the center of this story. In more than 30 years of telling it, he never once said the word aliens. He never asked anyone to believe in flying saucers. He only asked them to believe him, and by the end, the same government that sealed his file would put his story on a coin. This is Falcon Lake, the best documented UFO case in history. And it's never been solved. Stay with me to the end. Let me tell you who he was, because it matters enormously to this story. His name was Stefan Michalak. He was 51 years old, a Polish immigrant who'd survived the horrors of the Second World War and come to Canada in 1949. He was about the least likely UFO witness you could imagine. He was an industrial mechanic by trade, a practical, grounded man who worked metal for a living, with no interest in the paranormal and no history of tall tales. His passion was rock hunting. On weekends, he hiked into the bush with a hammer and a chisel, prospecting for quartz and silver. And there's a small, strange piece of poetry in this story, right from the start. Stefan Michalak worked at the Royal Canadian Mint in Winnipeg. He spent his weeks around silver, and his weekends hunting it. On the long weekend of May 20th, 1967, he drove out to Whiteshell Provincial Park, a stretch of Canadian wilderness about the size of Rhode Island, 90 miles east of Winnipeg. He knew the country well. He'd staked mining claims there before. That Saturday morning, he found a promising vein of quartz and got to work, and the woods were quiet, except for the tapping of his hammer on stone. And then, a little after noon, the geese went up. A whole flock burst off the water at once, and Stefan looked up to see what had spooked them. Two objects were coming down out of the sky. They glowed a bright red, and they were shaped like cigars. As they dropped lower, they seemed to flatten into discs. One of them stopped, hovered over the trees for a few seconds, then shot straight back up, and was gone. But the other kept coming down. Slowly, it settled onto a flat shelf of rock, about 160 feet away from where Stefan stood. And as it sat there, the red glow faded to orange, and then to a dull gray, the color of stainless steel. Stefan knew metal. He knew that hot steel comes out of a forge glowing red and cools down through orange to gray, which meant that whatever had just landed on that rock was only moments before extraordinarily hot. So, he did the thing that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He hid behind a rock, took out his pad and pencil, and started to sketch it. Like a broken machine he'd been called out to fix. For half an hour, he drew the shape, the dome on top, the way the air around it shimmered with heat. It never occurred to him to run. He was a man who'd lived through a Nazi occupation. A silver saucer on a rock was strange, but it wasn't, to him, frightening. It was mostly inconvenient. Then, a door slid open on the side of the craft and light poured out, and Stefan would spend the rest of his life struggling to describe that light. It was a color, he said, that doesn't quite exist. Not blue, not purple, something in between, and brighter than the daylight around it. Now, he had to get closer. He put on his welding goggles, which he'd brought to protect his eyes from flying rock chips, and which happened to have a tinted visor, and he walked up to the craft and looked inside. And what he saw is the part that's convinced serious people for over 50 years that Stefan Michalak wasn't making this up. Because he didn't describe a fantasy. He described an engine room. Inside was a maze of lights, beams running in horizontal and diagonal patterns, banks of colored lights, blinking in sequences that never repeated. But no seats, no controls he could recognize, no pilot, and he described the construction the way only a lifelong mechanic would. The metal was polished so bright, he could see his own reflection. There were no seams, no rivets, no weld lines anywhere. He said the walls looked about 1.5 feet thick, but they weren't solid. They were worked in a hollow honeycomb grid. This was, he said, the finest metalwork he'd ever seen in his life. And that bothered him more than anything else. He'd spent decades working metal, and he couldn't understand how this had been built. Then he heard voices, 2 of them muffled, like a conversation through a closed door. One pitched higher than the other, and they sounded human. And this is the detail that makes Stefan Michalak so different from every other UFO witness. He didn't think this was a spaceship. He assumed it was ours, an experimental military craft, American probably, from the height of the space race. So he called out to help. He assumed maybe they were in trouble. Maybe someone was hurt. He shouted in English, offering assistance. No answer. So he tried again in Russian, then German, Italian, French, Ukrainian. A lifetime of war and exile had given him 6 languages to say the same simple thing. I can help you. Nobody answered, and then the craft came alive. A whine started up, the heat rushed back, and Stefan felt like he was standing in front of an open oven. He still had his heavy welding glove on, so he reached out to touch the surface, to feel how hot it really was, and the glove melted onto his fingers. The door snapped shut, the craft began to rotate, and as it turned, a panel came around to face him. A small grid, maybe 9 inches by 6, drilled full of tiny holes in neat rows, like a vent, and out of that vent came a blast of hot gas that hit him square in the chest and set his shirt on fire. He tore his burning shirt off and stamped out the flames. And when he looked up, the craft was already lifting off the rock. It rose without a sound, the way it had come, and then a rush of air, and it was gone. And Stefan Michalak was alone in the clearing. His chest scorched raw, his head splitting, his stomach turning over. He staggered out of the woods, vomiting as he went, and eventually made it to the highway and flagged down that police car. The officer looked at him, listened to a piece of the story, said he had other duties to perform, got back in his car, and drove away. That was the first human being Stefan met after the strangest hour of his life. And he left him, standing on the road. Stefan got himself home to Winnipeg that night, and when his 9-year-old son walked into the bedroom, the first thing the boy noticed wasn't the burns. It was the smell, a reek of sulfur and burnt electronics, and it wasn't coming from the clothes. It was coming out of his father's skin, and it lasted for weeks. Now, here's where the case stops being a story and starts being a stack of evidence. Because Stefan Michalak got very, very sick. He couldn't keep food down. On the morning of the encounter, he weighed 180 pounds. 1 week later, he weighed 158. 22 pounds, gone in 7 days. He had blackouts, headaches, and gaps in his memory. His doctor found raised red sores across his upper stomach and singed hair at his hairline. And the pattern of the burns matched a grid, the same rows of dots as the vent on the craft. His undershirt, the one he'd torn off, had charred holes burned through it in the very same pattern. And then, the blood tests. Stefan's lymphocyte count, a type of white blood cell, had crashed far below normal. Doctors knew that kind of drop could come from one thing above all others: radiation. A radiologist reviewing the case said the picture was typical of whole-body radiation exposure and estimated the dose at between 100 and 200 Roentgens. 4 scale, 400 Roentgens will usually kill you. He noted the exposure could only have lasted seconds. Any longer, and it would have. And the burns wouldn't go away. They healed and came back. Healed and came back again. Doctors tried medication after medication, and nothing worked. And over the months, they realized the sores were returning on a cycle every 112 days, right on schedule. More than a dozen doctors examined him in Canada and the United States, and not one of them could say what was wrong. So, Stefan paid his own way to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota, one of the finest hospitals on earth. They ran every test they had, and they came up empty too. But they ruled one thing out, and it matters. The Mayo psychiatric report found no delusion, no hallucination, no mental illness of any kind. Whatever'd happened to this man, he wasn't inventing it. And while the doctors worked, the case pulled in nearly every authority you can name. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police opened a file. So did the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Department of Health, the Department of National Defense. A civilian UFO group sent an investigator who photographed the burns just days after the event. The U.S. Air Force came, too. Before it was over, the Falcon Lake file was about 300 pages thick. But they had a problem. Nobody could find the site. 5 days after the encounter, the Air Force sent a search party into the Whiteshell, and they found nothing. They put Stefan in a helicopter, they walked the ground with him, and the landing spot simply wouldn't appear. And one man in particular was determined to make the whole thing disappear. A Royal Canadian Air Force officer, Squadron Leader Paul Biss Key, who didn't believe a word of it. To Biss Key, the saucer was nonsense, and the witness was a drunk who'd hallucinated the whole thing. And Biss Key had a lead. The motel bartender said he'd served Stefan 5 or 6 beers the night before. So, Biss Key built his case. He took Stefan back to that same bar, offered him a beer. Stefan said no. Offered him a rye and ginger, and Stefan said yes, and had a few and loosened up. And that was all Biss Key needed for his report. The man got drunk and hallucinated a flying saucer. He even floated a second theory, that Stefan gotten drunk and fallen onto a hot barbecue grill. His source for that was a woman who wouldn't come forward, because she'd spent the weekend at the lake with a man who wasn't her husband. That was the case against Stefan Michalak. A bar tab, a rumor, and a hunch. And then, on the 25th of June, Stefan found the site himself. He led the searchers straight to it, about 50 yards from where they'd already been looking. And it was all still there. A ring where the ground had been scorched. A semicircle of earth and pine needles pushed up around the rim, where nothing grew. Investigators collected the soil and the rock and sent it to the RCMP crime lab in Ottawa. And when the results came back, the tone of the entire file changed. The soil contained radium-226, the same radioactive material that used to make old watch dials glow in the dark. And there was so much of it that the lab flagged the area as a serious health hazard and recommended it be closed to the public. Biss' hunch fell apart. And when the Air Force's chief skeptic finally wrote his report, he put 3 things on the record that he couldn't make go away. The man's illness, the man's burns, and the radioactive circle on the rock. And he described all 3 with a single word: unexplainable. And then, it got stranger. 1 year later, almost to the day, Stefan went back to that rock. And in a crack in the stone, under some moss, he found 2 bars of metal. The lab took them apart. One was 93% silver, the other 96%, and both were coated in crushed uranium. They were radioactive. Now remember, this was the single most searched patch of ground in Canada. Police, military, radiation officers, all of them had combed that circle for a year, and either those bars had appeared sometime in that year, or every search team from 2 countries had walked right over them. Even Biss Key, the man who came to call Stefan a liar, sent a message back to headquarters, admitting that if this was a hoax, someone was going to a truly extraordinary amount of effort to pull it off. And around this point, the government closed ranks. When a member of parliament raised Falcon Lake in the House of Commons, the speaker cut him off. When one MP was finally allowed to see the file, pages had already been pulled from it. The official reason was that a full release wouldn't be in the public interest. And here's the small, sharp irony at the center of it. That silenced member of parliament later went on to become the Governor-General of Canada. The government's own representative had once asked his government what happened at Falcon Lake. And his government refused to tell him. So, let's turn the lights on and give the skeptics their due, because there is a real case to answer. Start with the famous grid burns, those neat rows of dots you see in the photographs. Here's the uncomfortable fact. That tidy grid pattern doesn't appear until January of 1968, 8 months after the encounter. The doctor who saw Stefan the day after the event described something quite different. Irregular, blotchy, unevenly spaced burns. And when the perfect grid finally did show up, the psychiatrist at the Mayo Clinic looked at those particular lesions and called them, in his words, factitial, which is the clinical way of saying self-inflicted. The radiation has a possible mundane answer, too. The white shell is naturally rich in uranium and radium, and chemists suggested the readings could have come from a natural vein in the rock, or from contamination by ordinary radium-based luminous paint. And the silver bars make the story look worse, not better. Their composition matched commercial sterling silver, right down to the trace metals in the alloy, and they were coated in foundry sand, the kind you'd find in a metal shop. They surfaced a full year late, at a site that dozens of people could reach, after the professionals had already searched it and found nothing. To a skeptic, that metal wasn't discovered. It was placed, and there was a fire watchtower overlooking that whole area with a ranger on duty, who saw nothing at all. The leading skeptics of the day called Falcon Lake a badly executed hoax, and closed the book. That's the honest case against it, and it's not nothing. But it doesn't touch the things that matter most, because the grid may be shown up late, but the burns of 1967 were real. And no one has ever disputed them. A doctor documented first-degree burns the day after the encounter. There's a charred undershirt with holes burned through it in a pattern, and you can still go and see it. It's on display at the University of Manitoba to this day. If Stefan faked a grid in 1968, that does nothing to explain the chest that was scorched raw in May of 1967. And it does nothing to explain the 22 pounds he lost in a single week, which is very nearly impossible, unless a person is gravely ill. And it does nothing to explain the collapsed white blood cell count that a radiologist read as radiation exposure. And it does nothing to explain why a man would do all of this for no money. Because if you follow the money in the Falcon Lake case, you find there isn't any. Stefan never wrote a bestseller. He put out a small booklet that lost money, and he mostly gave it away for free to people who wouldn't stop asking, because he was so tired of telling the story out loud. He paid for the Mayo Clinic himself, which wasn't cheap. If this was a hoax, it cost him his health, his savings, and his peace. And it paid him nothing. And here's the thing you can't get around. Every official body that investigated Falcon Lake, including the ones that went in trying to debunk it, came out the other side unable to explain it. Biaseski, the man who wanted him to be a liar, wrote the word unexplainable. The Department of National Defense admitted it was unable to provide any evidence that would dispute Michalak's story. And the Condon Committee, an American study specifically built to close UFO cases and put them to bed, filed Falcon Lake as unexplained. They even added a line you almost never see in an official government report, that if the encounter was real, it would demonstrate the existence of alien flying vehicles in our environment. So, consider the two possibilities honestly. If Falcon Lake was a hoax, then a 51-year-old mechanic burned his own chest, starved 22 pounds off his own body, tanked his own blood chemistry, fooled more than a dozen doctors and a Mayo Clinic psychiatrist, salted a patch of Canadian wilderness with radium, planted radioactive silver, and kept the lie up for free in pain for the last 32 years of his life, and never once broke. never embellished, never recanted, and never even claimed it was aliens. Or something landed on that rock that we still can't name. Stefan Michalak died in 1999 at the age of 83. He never changed a word of his account. He went to his grave insisting only that he'd told the truth about what he saw, whatever it was. And in 2018, more than 50 years after that afternoon in the woods, the Royal Canadian Mint, the very institution he'd worked for, struck a coin to commemorate the Falcon Lake incident. It's made of pure silver, and under a black light, it glows. A man walked into the Whiteshell hunting for silver, and half a century later, his own government minted his story in it. The burns were real. The radiation was real. The scorched circle on the rock was real. 4 separate government agencies on 2 continents examined all of it. And the best word any of them could find was the one the skeptic himself wrote down. Unexplainable. Whatever came down out of the sky over Falcon Lake on that spring afternoon, it left marks on a man's body that returned like clockwork for years. It left radiation in the ground that's still measurable. And it left a case that the most powerful institutions in 2 countries couldn't solve. And, in the end, chose to seal. Stefan Michalak never asked you to believe in flying saucers. He only ever asked you to believe him. And more than half a century later, standing over the evidence he left behind, that no longer seems like very much to ask.